Hello everyone. Let's continue reading the free economy publication called The Alternative to Capitalism and Socialism by Dr. Theophil Christen. Right now, I am reading from the last part of this little booklet, the Appendix, which is written by Philip Pye, the translator, and I might say a person with a very special perspective on money writing. We're on page 36. Examples of the disastrous results of falling prices due to currency mismanagement are only too plentiful during the last few years. The post-war world crisis began in March 1920 in Japan, when the Japanese government forced a deflationary policy on the banks. The post-war world crisis began in March 1920 in Japan, when the Japanese government forced a deflationary policy on the banks. Paper money was withdrawn from circulation, with the result that prices fell 40% within a year, and Japan experienced the severest commercial crisis in her history. The example of Japan was followed by the Central Monetary Authority of the United States, the Federal Reserve Board, in the summer of 1920, and the resulting fall of prices of 46% within a year threw 7 million American workmen out of employment. The policy of deflation was then reversed, with the result that unemployment disappeared. In England, a more gradual deflationary policy has been obstinately persisted in by the English government and the Bank of England. English prices have, in consequence, fallen over 50% from 1920 to 1929, and during all these years, from 1 million to 2.5 million English workers have been thrown out of employment. In countries like Belgium, on the other hand, where there had been no deflation of the currency, there had been no fall of prices, no crisis, and no unemployment. These uncontested facts, which could easily be multiplied, show that a country which adopts the gold standard is doomed to experience periods of relative activity followed by crisis and stagnation of economic life. But in spite of the disastrous effects of an unstable currency, such as the gold standard, orthodox economists were slow to admit the necessity of currency stabilization. To the orthodox economist, up to about the year 1920, the currency standard meant the gold standard. The gold standard was sacrosanct. The disturbances and disorganization it created were attributed to other causes or regarded as inevitable. Rising prices stimulate economic activity and consequently employment. But rising prices are naturally followed by falling prices, with their devastating effect on business and trade. Then employment falls even more rapidly. Only a policy of stabilization can give security to business and employment. This deplorable state of matters has now changed. The catastrophic trade slump of 1920 and the still more ruinous depression since 1929, obviously connected with the currency, focused attention on the dangers of fluctuating prices and made the stabilization of money a practical problem which many investigators attempted to solve. The only scientific solution of the problem is, as has already been shown in the foregoing chapters, to adapt the amount of money in circulation to the amount of goods produced, and in this way to stabilize the general level of prices. This solution was considered by the founder of monetary science, Ricardo, at the beginning of the 19th century. Ricardo recognized that the only theoretical possibility of stabilization is a paper currency varied in amount to counteract changes in the price level. Ricardo, however, held that in practice stabilization is impossible. How, he asks, can we know whether prices are rising or falling? If we take 12 commodities, 6 may be rising and 6 falling in price. The answer to Ricardo's objection was only given half a century later by the English mathematical economist Jevons, who introduced a method of measuring the fluctuations of the price level by comparing from time to time the average price of a large number of commodities. In Ricardo's example, 6 prices may be rising and 6 falling, but the average of the 12 prices will show the general tendency. It is through Jevons' invention of index numbers of prices that the stabilization of money has become possible. The practical proposals to attain stabilization may be grouped as follows. Number 1, stabilization of money by regulation of the supply of gold. The 4 gold-producing countries, England, the United States, Mexico, and Russia, or England and the United States alone, could agree to prohibit the working of certain gold mines when prices, measured by index numbers, tended to rise, the owners of the mines being, of course, compensated. This proposal has been made by Professor Leffield of Johannesburg University in Journal des Économistes, Paris, 1918. Gold, Prices en de Witwatersrand, 1919, and Restoration of the World's Currencies, 1923. The second proposal, stabilization of prices by regulation of the demand for gold. The central banks of the various countries could agree to increase their demand for gold if the index numbers of prices tended to rise. Gold could, for example, be bought and added to the reserves of the bank. If, on the other hand, prices tended to fall, the banks could agree to economize in the monetary use of gold, for example, by substituting paper money for the gold coins in circulation. Number 3, stabilization of prices by variation of the weight of gold in the monetary unit. If the index numbers of prices tend to rise, the monetary unit is made heavier and vice versa. As gold dollars of different weights could not obviously circulate together, gold coins would be dispensed with altogether. Instead of a gold coinage, paper money would be issued redeemable in a varying weight of gold, not, as before the war, in a fixed weight of gold. And number 4, stabilization of prices by the regulation of credit by the central banks of the various countries acting in agreement and in accordance with index numbers of prices. If prices rise, it is proposed that the banks shall reduce the monetary circulation by restricting credit. Credit could be restricted either by raising the rate of interest at which the central bank grants loans, or by restricting the amount of loans it grants. In either case, the flow of money through the bank would be partially arrested. More money would flow in than flowed out. The bank's reserve would increase, and the circulation of money outside the bank would decrease, causing the desired fall of prices. Price stabilization by means of credit regulation could be applied either to a paper currency, as proposed by J.M. Keynes, or to a gold currency, as proposed by Professor Gesell in Sweden, and by R.G. Hawtrey, adopted since 1922 by the Central Monetary Authority, the Federal Reserve Board in America. And proposal number 5, stabilization of prices by the issue or withdrawal of paper money, not freed money, by a government Bureau of Statistics in accordance with the index numbers of prices. This proposal has been advocated by E.B. Andrews, Arthur Fonda, Frank Parsons, and others. The use of gold in the first three plans causes unnecessary expense and technical difficulties. Anything that can be done by them can be done more cheaply and easily by the fifth plan, the issue and withdrawal of paper money. The fourth plan, price stabilization by means of credit control, is often supported by the argument that bankers control credit through the creation of credit. But in reality, neither bankers nor the state can create credit, for credit means, ultimately, a sum of money saved and offered for loan. The function of the bank is to act as intermediary between savers and loan takers, so that the amount of credit they grant is governed by the amount of savings they receive as deposits. Apart from these deposits, the banks can only increase the amount of credit they grant by decreasing their reserves. Stabilization by means of credit control is therefore merely a special form of the fifth plan, stabilization of prices through the issue or withdrawal of paper money. And this issue and withdrawal of paper money should certainly be controlled by a state currency office, bound by statistics of prices, and not by private institutions such as banks, which are bound only by considerations of profit. Banks can only control the market rate of interest indirectly by their present dangerous power of increasing or decreasing the monetary circulation. They have not the power of determining the rate of interest directly. Even when the monopoly of the Bank of England was at its height in the middle of the last century, Tuke and Newmarch noted that the bank was compelled to adjust its rate of interest carefully to the market rate. If it set its rate higher than the market rate, it lost business to outside competitors. And if it set the bank rate lower than the market rate, its resources were soon in danger of exhaustion. The weekly fixing of the bank rate by the governors and the court of the bank, which was supposed to control the market rate of interest, was thus a solemn humbug. The governors and court determined the market rate of interest like Chanticleer by his crowing determined the sunrise. First the crowing, then the response. The advocacy of credit control in connection with the gold currency by so many English and American economists marks the beginning of the end of the gold standard. Nobody now wishes to see gold coins in circulation, and if in addition the value of the currency is to be determined not by gold, but by credit control, what role has gold left to play? The only logical solution of all such contradictions is the adoption of a scientific paper currency. Stabilization of prices by means of regulated issues of ordinary paper money, as in the fifth plan, closely resembles Gesell's proposal. Gesell, however, does not recommend its adoption without change. He grants that the immediate result would be the same as with his reform, namely, increased prosperity due to the greater security of economic life and the absence of crisis and unemployment. But such conditions, especially if stabilization were adopted by all countries, would admittedly lead to a fall in the rate of interest, and Gesell shows that if the rate of interest falls, some people begin to hoard their savings instead of bringing them to the banks, and thereby returning them to circulation. The government currency office would then be in a dilemma. If it decided not to replace this hoarded money with a new issue, the result would be a fall of prices and a crisis, such as occurs periodically with the gold standard. And if it decided to replace the hoarded money with fresh paper money, prices would remain stabilized, but the rate of interest would in consequence fall still further, and still more money would be hoarded. The danger of such a monetary system is obvious. At any time, the hoarded money might be thrown on the market when it would cause an uncontrollable and devastating rise of prices. Stabilization by means of ordinary paper money, or by varying the weight of gold in the monetary unit as proposed by Professor Irving Fisher, is possible if only one country, or only a few countries, adopt these plans. In this case, when through stabilization the rate of interest falls, savings, instead of it being hoarded, are exported. But only through freed money can all countries stabilize their currencies. It is at this point that the necessity of Gesell's freed money becomes apparent. With freed money, there is no possibility of money being withheld from circulation by hoarders or speculators, for no one can hoard a commodity that depreciates. The fall in the rate of interest is no longer, therefore, an obstacle to the stabilization of money. Only through freed money is the stabilization of money possible. Closely connected with the stabilization of money in Gesell's second proposal, the abolition of interest. Closely connected with the stabilization of money is Gesell's second proposal, the abolition of interest. The abolition of the other form of unearned income, private rent on land, by the Freed Land Reform, depends, as already explained, on the elimination of interest. The history of private rent is a history of oppression and revolt, and palliatives, such as peasant proprietorship of the land, are in the long run useless. The European country with the oldest peasant proprietorship, Switzerland, is now in the hands of the worst type of landlord, namely the mortgage banks. Gesell is here attacking an abuse as old as civilization, and one that has been widely recognized and condemned. To Aristotle, interest is absolutely contrary to the nature of things. The Mosaic Law prohibits interest between Israelites. Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Psalms, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, for instance. And the New Testament makes this prohibition universal. Luke, Thessalonians, and James. I have not listed the verses of these various books, but they are listed here in the hard copy, which you can find online. The Hebrew word for to take interest means also to bite. The Talmud rejects both interest payers and interest takers as witnesses. Every transaction involving interest has the consequence for both parties that they can no longer be accepted as witnesses. Those who make interest contracts, both interest takers and interest payers, are unworthy to bear witness. Interest taking was not practiced among the early Christians. It was heavily penalized by Pope Leo and by the Council of Vienna. Colbert, consulting the theological faculty of the University of Paris about the project of a state bank in 1673, was informed that interest contravenes both natural right and the law of God. The opposition of the Catholic Church to interest was strongly reaffirmed by Pope Benedict XIV in the middle of the 18th century, and was only abandoned in practice at the beginning of the industrial era in France, about 1830. The Protestant reformers Luther and Zwingli, but not Calvin, were also vehemently opposed to interest, and it is forbidden by the Mohammedan religion. God permits sale but not usury, says the Quran, a precept which a modern Mohammedan ruler, Ibn Saud, has lately endeavored to enforce. I wish to apologize here to anyone who takes offense at this word, Mohammedan. But besides this widespread moral condemnation, interest has also evoked scientific criticism. Besides this widespread moral condemnation, interest has also evoked scientific criticism. The earliest economists, the physiocrats in France, and their successors, the Manchester economists in England, aimed at the abolition of interest through their policy of laissez-faire, laissez-passer. The German economist Oppenheimer rightly interprets history as an unceasing struggle for possession of the sources of interest, and the intensity of the struggle in modern times may be measured by the extent of the socialistic movement, which is essentially directed against interest. Socialism is based on the economic theories of Karl Marx, who, believing that interest depends on possession of the means of production, was compelled to advocate their nationalization. It is exceedingly easy to prove that Marx's theory of interest is wrong, but orthodox economists find it less easy to give the true explanation of interest. It is exceedingly easy to prove that Marx's theory of interest is wrong, but orthodox economists find it less easy to give the true explanation of interest. Professor Guide, putting the question, "Why does capital produce interest?" remarks that quite lately learned volumes have been devoted to answering this question. Many answers have been given, which proves that economists are not very sure of having discovered the right one. The problem has been courageously formulated by Professor Carver of Harvard University as follows. Interest is the crux of almost every program of fundamental social reform. If interest is a payment which is necessary to induce a sufficient number of men to perform a necessary economic function, saving, there is no justification for socialism and socialists. If it is not necessary to the securing of that result, there is no excuse for anything but socialism and socialists. From Carver, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, May 1918. The majority of modern economists regard interest as a necessary evil, and so it is as long as we retain the present form of money. For if interest did not exist, the present form of money would immediately disappear from circulation into the hordes of savers, as actually happened whenever the prohibition of interest by the medieval popes was obeyed. Money was saved out of existence, and economic life came to a standstill. The majority of modern economists regard interest as a necessary evil, and so it is, as long as we retain the present form of money. For if interest did not exist, the present form of money would immediately disappear from circulation into the hordes of the savers, as actually happened whenever the prohibition of interest by the medieval popes was obeyed. Money was saved out of existence, and economic life came to a standstill. It occurred to no economists before Gesell that a simple change in the form of money would make hoarding impossible, thus opening the road to the universal stabilization of money and to the abolition of interest. One great epoch in the history of human development is marked by the invention of money. For without money, the division of labor, the basis of all civilization, is impossible. And another great epoch will be marked by the stabilization of money and the accompanying disappearance of interest. That is the aim of Gesell's reform, free economy. One great epoch in the history of human development is marked by the invention of money, for without money, the division of labor, the basis of all civilization, is impossible. And another great epoch will be marked by the stabilization of money and the accompanying disappearance of interest. That is the aim of Gesell's reform, free economy.